At first, the darkness offers almost nothing. A sloping passage disappears beneath broken stone, hardened mud, and the remains of a collapsed ceiling. There is no golden shrine waiting in the gloom, no polished sarcophagus dominating a burial chamber, no royal body resting beneath painted gods. The objects most people associate with a pharaoh's tomb are absent, yet the emptiness is deceptive. In the debris lie fragments of pale stone vessels, pieces of pottery, flakes of painted plaster, yellow stars once set against a blue ceiling, traces of Aakheperenre frieze, and damaged passages from the Amduat, the royal guide to the sun god's nightly journey through the underworld. The tomb has not yielded a treasure chamber. It has yielded something stranger, the outline of a burial from which the king, his stone coffin, and most of his funerary equipment have vanished. For more than a century, any announcement linking a newly identified pharaoh's tomb with the age of Tutankhamun has carried an impossible burden. Howard Carter's discovery in 1922 fixed an image of royal archaeology in the public imagination's sealed doors, glittering chambers, intact objects crowded together. This tomb offers the opposite spectacle. Its importance comes not from wealth preserved in place, but from damage, absence, and fragments made to speak. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. Because this story is not simply about finding a tomb, it is about discovering that a tomb can be located with confidence, while the fate of the burial inside remains unresolved. Even the date of discovery requires care. The entrance was not first uncovered in 2025 despite the way headlines compressed the story. Archaeological work began in October 2022, and on October 31st a staircase leading toward the structure known as C4 emerged beneath debris. The entrance and main passage were investigated that season. What the excavators had found physically was already before them a badly damaged rock-cut monument concealed in the western desert of Thebes. What they did not yet possess was a secure identity for its owner. That took time. Names survived only in broken pieces. Decoration had been torn from walls by water and collapse. And the evidence had to be recovered from a burial environment that resisted reconstruction. By 2023, the possibility that C4 belonged to Thutmose II had entered specialist discussion. The case strengthened as excavation continued and fragments were assembled. On October 31, 2024, pieces bearing the full throne name Aakheperenre could be joined, transforming a persuasive identification into something firmer. Then, in February 2025, Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities announced the tomb widely as that of Thutmose II, an early 18th dynasty ruler whose burial place had long remained uncertain. The distinction matters. The staircase appeared in 2022. The archaeological argument developed over the following years. The public revelation came in 2025. Discovery, identification, and announcement were not one dramatic moment but a patient sequence. That slow accumulation of proof is central to understanding why the announcement carried such unusual weight. The announcement was immediately described in sweeping language as the first royal tomb found since Tutankhamun. That phrase captures the excitement, but not the full archaeological record. Royal burials were discovered elsewhere in Egypt after 1922, including the tombs of kings at Tanis. A more accurate claim is narrower and still extraordinary. C4 was the first newly identified rock-cut tomb of a New Kingdom pharaoh in the Theban necropolis since Tutankhamun's tomb entered the modern world. It also appeared to resolve one of the 18th dynasty's most elusive royal burial places. Yet even this achievement came with a warning. Archaeology had found where Thutmose II was apparently buried, not necessarily where he ultimately remained. That difference is embedded in the tomb itself. C4 is sometimes called empty because it lacks the central elements expected from an undisturbed royal interment. No mummy was found inside. No stone sarcophagus occupied the probable burial chamber. No complete canopic equipment, royal coffin ensemble, or glittering collection of grave goods waited beneath the collapse. But empty can erase the evidence that made identification possible. The tomb retained broken alabaster or travertine vessels, ceramics associated with an early 18th dynasty burial, and decoration reserved for a king. Some vessel pieces carried Aakheperenre, Thutmose II's throne name, while others connected the burial with his great royal wife, Hatshepsut. The most important things were gone, but what remained was precise enough to restore a royal name. This produces the first great contradiction. A pharaoh's tomb was found because ancient destruction failed to remove everything. Floodwater devastated the monument. Plaster detached from its walls. Ceilings collapsed, and mud filled parts of the chambers to formidable depths. Someone in antiquity also appears to have removed the burial's principal contents. Whether that removal was an emergency rescue after flooding, a planned reburial, a later dismantling, or a sequence involving several events remains a problem the evidence has not solved. The excavators argue that the king and much of his equipment were transferred elsewhere. That interpretation is compelling, but no ancient account has been found describing the operation, and no confirmed second burial has been opened. Thutmose II therefore returns to history through a place defined by subtraction. His name survives on pieces small enough to be overlooked. His royal status survives in stars separated from their ceiling, and underworld scenes separated from their walls. Hatshepsut's presence survives not as a monumental portrait, but in inscriptions tied to the burial preparations of the husband, whose memory would later stand in the shadow of her reign. Every remaining fragment points toward a ceremony that once filled these rooms with order, ritual, and royal authority. Every major absence points toward a crisis that disrupted that design. The result is more unsettling than an intact tomb. An intact burial answers certain questions simply by existing. C4 opens questions in every direction. If Thutmose II was placed here, when was he removed? Who supervised the transfer? What survived the flood? What was stripped away later? Does the mummy displayed under his name in Cairo truly belong to him? Could another monument, still hidden beneath stone and ancient construction material, preserve the next stage of the burial story? Scholars still debate these problems because the evidence remains incomplete and sometimes points in competing directions. For now, the clearest fact is also the strangest. More than 100 years after Tutankhamun's tomb reshaped expectations of Egyptian archaeology, another Theban pharaoh's rock-cut tomb was identified. It did not open as a chamber of gold. It opened as a damaged archive of a disappearance. Beneath the mud and fallen stone, archaeologists recovered the place where a forgotten king had once been prepared for eternity. But the king himself was gone. The king was gone, but the landscape that had hidden his tomb remained, hiding in plain sight, west of the famous Valley of the Kings. Beyond the routes followed by most visitors, the desert breaks into a system of ravines, side valleys, and stony basins. These are the Western Wadis of Thebes, a region less immediately dramatic than the narrow royal valley to the east, yet important to the burial history of the early New Kingdom. C4 lies in Wadi Sea, within the broader area known as Gabanat el-Kurud, roughly 2.5 to 3 kilometers west of the Valley of the Kings. The crowds disappear, the paths become uncertain, and the limestone folds into a landscape where a tomb entrance can vanish beneath flood debris for centuries. The Western Wadis were never wholly unknown. Explorers, surveyors, antiquities officials, and local workers had passed through them for generations. Tombs had been recorded, robbed chambers entered, pottery collected, and royal associations recognized. Yet archaeological landscapes are shaped not only by what is found, but by the expectations determining where people look hardest. The Valley of the Kings possessed an overwhelming gravitational pull. Its cliffs contained rulers whose names dominated the new kingdom, and each excavation there seemed capable of producing another royal revelation. The Western Valleys acquired a different reputation. They were often treated as peripheral ground, connected especially with queens, princesses, royal relatives, and elite women of the 18th dynasty. Several tombs in and around Gabanat el-Kurud did belong to women of the royal household, but a useful pattern hardened into an assumption. This matters because tomb hunting has never been a matter of walking across empty desert until a doorway appears. Search strategies depend upon models. Archaeologists study geology, ancient paths, spoil heaps, pottery scatters, foundation deposits, and known monuments. They decide which slopes are promising and which depressions are natural. They inherit conclusions, even when they intend to challenge them. If a district is categorized mainly as a cemetery for royal women, then the possibility that it concealed the missing tomb of a king becomes less urgent. The absence of a known pharaoh's burial can reinforce the classification. No king has been found here. Therefore, kings were probably not buried here. C4 would eventually expose the circular logic. The region's ancient name is unknown, and its original boundaries are difficult to reconstruct. Modern labels divide the wadis for convenience, but ancient builders did not experience the desert as a plan printed on paper. They moved through channels cut by water, around cliffs weathered into natural screens, and along routes that may have carried practical, ritual, and political meaning. A valley could be close to another in straight-line distance, yet visually isolated. A low ridge could conceal construction from anyone approaching along the wrong path. The Western Wadis offered seclusion without complete remoteness. Workers and supplies could reach them from the Theban settlement zone, while branching topography created pockets of privacy suited to royal burial. What survives in the record suggests this was not marginal land, but a carefully used extension of the royal necropolis. One lesser-known clue lies in the distribution of early 18th dynasty burials. Before the Valley of the Kings became standardized, royal funerary planning was more experimental. Tomb forms, locations, and approaches changed as rulers and officials tested how best to protect the dead while maintaining the ritual geography of Western Thebes. Some monuments associated with the dynasty's earliest kings sit apart from the later concentration of royal tombs. Others were altered, reused, or connected to reburial episodes difficult to disentangle. The neat image of one valley reserved for kings and another for queens belongs more to modern classification than to ancient practice. Scholars still debate how deliberate these spatial distinctions were, especially while the new royal necropolis was still taking shape. Gabanat el-Kurud illustrates that complexity. Its Arabic name is commonly rendered as the Cemetery of the Monkeys, a label linked to discoveries of painted baboon imagery and funerary material in the area. The name is memorable, but it can make the district sound like a curiosity rather than part of a royal landscape. Here, Tombs associated with high-status women existed beside unfinished cuts, damaged chambers, and traces of activity whose owners remain uncertain. Robbery, flash floods, rock falls, and ancient reuse blurred the original arrangement. Some entrances were visible, others were buried. Some tombs could be assigned by inscriptions, while others survived only as architecture stripped of names. The evidence remained incomplete, and no map could restore the cemetery exactly as it had existed in the 15th century BCE. There was also a practical reason the area resisted attention. The Wadis are harsh working environments. Loose stone shifts underfoot. Heat reflects from pale cliffs. Excavated material must be moved by hand through confined spaces and unstable slopes. Flood deposits can look like natural ground until a cut edge or buried wall reveals otherwise. In some places, water had carried mud and stone deep into tomb passages, then allowed the mass to dry into material almost as hard as masonry. A structure could therefore be present without offering clean surface signs. The desert had not simply covered C4, it had incorporated the tomb into the geology of the slope. By the early 21st century, renewed mapping and systematic investigation began changing how the Western Wadis were understood. Rather than treating isolated tombs as disconnected discoveries, researchers examined the valley as a single evolving necropolis. Ancient drainage, construction debris, access routes, and relationships between monuments became as important as decorated chambers. This wider approach created the conditions in which an unexpected royal tomb could be recognized. The objective was not merely to find spectacular objects. It was to understand why tombs occupied particular places, how builders managed the terrain, and how water transformed it. That shift made Wadi C especially intriguing. Its position did not fit the popular image of a pharaoh's burial, but the landscape contained signs that important activity had occurred there. Nearby tombs and deposits suggested an early New Kingdom context. The valley offered concealment, workable limestone, and proximity to established royal burial zones. At the same time, its drainage made it dangerous. Any monument cut too close to seasonal water could become a trap for forces its builders underestimated. The qualities that made the Wadi private also made it vulnerable. When excavation resumed there in October 2022, no one could know that the old assumptions were about to fail. The team was working in a district associated more strongly with royal women than with kings, reading a surface rearranged by millennia of collapse and flood. Beneath the mud and stone lay a staircase. It did not announce itself with inscriptions or treasure. It simply descended toward a sealed architectural problem, waiting for the first step to be exposed. The first exposed step did not reveal a royal name, it revealed more work. On October 18, 2020, the excavation team began clearing an area in Wadi C, where earlier investigation had suggested a deposit or cut beneath the accumulated debris. The ground was not clean desert sand. It was a dense mixture of mud, fallen limestone, flood-borne stone, and material shifted by centuries of erosion. Every layer had to be removed carefully because a natural hollow, an ancient pit, and the entrance to a tomb can resemble one another when their edges have been buried and distorted. Then, on October 31st, the shape became unmistakable. A descending staircase emerged, one step after another, dropping into the slope. There was still no reason to assume that it belonged to a king. The surrounding cemetery had long been associated with women of the early 18th dynasty, and the team initially considered the possibility that the staircase led to a royal wife or daughter. That expectation was reasonable, but the staircase itself offered few clues. Its builders had cut it into the rock and positioned it where runoff, collapse, and later deposits could conceal the approach. The excavators were not opening a sealed doorway untouched since antiquity. They were recovering an entrance from a landscape that had repeatedly moved across it. Progress was measured in days of removal rather than moments of revelation. On November 8th, the doorway was located. Beyond it, a descending corridor continued into the limestone, but the passage was obstructed and unstable. The tomb had suffered damage on a scale that was not yet fully visible. Mud and rock filled the root, while sections of the ceiling had failed. The air inside carried the stillness of a closed underground space, but little of the order its ancient builders had intended. Entering meant working through material that might contain decoration, pottery, or inscribed fragments no larger than a hand. Speed could destroy the evidence needed to identify the monument. On November 13th, the team reached Chamber A, the largest room and the space later interpreted as the probable burial chamber. The interval between the staircase and the chamber had been less than 2 weeks, yet the real excavation was only beginning. What lay inside was not a recognizable royal interior waiting to be photographed. The chamber was overwhelmed by collapse. In places, deposits of rubble and hardened silt rose toward 2 meters. Painted plaster had detached from walls and ceiling, broken into pieces, and become mixed with stone. Water had rearranged the tomb surfaces so thoroughly that decoration intended to be read as a continuous sacred composition survived as scattered color within a geological mass. Nothing in those first days resembled a triumphant unveiling. Headlamps caught rough stone, damp-coloured sediment, and occasional flashes of pigment. The deeper the team moved, the clearer it became that reaching the chamber and interpreting the chamber were entirely different tasks. The method now had to change. Finding the chamber was an architectural achievement. Understanding it required excavation almost fragment by fragment. Material was removed by hand, recorded, sorted, and examined for traces of pigment or carving. Pale pieces of stone could be natural limestone, undecorated vessel fragments, or parts of an inscribed object. A thin patch of blue might belong to a ceiling once covered with stars. A line of yellow or black could preserve part of a hieroglyph, but only if its original orientation and neighbouring fragments could eventually be established. The tomb did not provide its identity in a single inscription above a door. It released clues slowly, from debris that had no obligation to preserve them in useful order. This is where the popular image of archaeological discovery becomes misleading. The dramatic moment was not necessarily the instant a staircase appeared. It was the long period in which specialists learned what the staircase meant. Thousands of pieces could be recovered without producing a complete name. Fragments had to be cleaned without erasing fragile surfaces, compared with one another, photographed, measured, and sometimes physically joined. The work resembled the reconstruction of a document shredded, soaked, crushed, and mixed with the remains of the room that once held it. Even when parts of a royal title appeared, scholars still had to determine whether they belonged to the tomb's owner, to a funerary gift, or to material displaced from somewhere else. The first recognizable inscriptions did not immediately settle the question. A birth name beginning with Thut suggested a king named Thutmose, while a damaged throne name beginning Aakhepe could point toward more than one ruler. Thutmose I bore Aakheperenre, Thutmose II bore Aakheperenre. On an intact monument, the difference is clear, on broken alabaster, with crucial signs absent or split across separate pieces. Certainty could not be forced. The excavators had entered a royal-looking tomb, but royal-looking was not enough. Early 18th dynasty kings shared artistic conventions, religious texts, and elements of titulary. A plausible identification had to survive the possibility that the fragments belonged to the wrong Thutmose. Weeks became months. Additional pieces emerged from the deposits, including fragments of vessels whose smooth, pale surfaces had carried formal inscriptions. Some came from duck-shaped containers, others belonged to a larger jar. Their shapes hinted at expensive funerary equipment, but their broken condition also revealed how completely the burial had been disturbed. The pieces were not concentrated neatly beside a coffin. They were dispersed through collapse and sediment, as though the tomb's contents and decoration had been caught in the same violent rearrangement. What survives in the record suggests that water, structural failure, and ancient removal all contributed, although their exact sequence remains uncertain. One fragment, only about 2 centimeters wide, eventually changed the direction of the inquiry by preserving part of Hatshepsut's title and name as Great Royal Wife. Yet even this clue required context. Hatshepsut had been the wife of Thutmose II and the daughter of Thutmose III. Her appearance beside the incomplete royal names made Thutmose II the stronger candidate. But the team continued assembling the case rather than treating one sliver as magic proof. More fragments would be needed, and the full throne name would not be reconstructed until October 31st, 2024, exactly 2 years after the staircase first appeared. The sequence reveals how a tomb returns to history. First, there is an irregularity in the ground, then a step, a doorway, a corridor, and a chamber filled with destruction. Only much later does a name emerge from the debris. C4 was physically opened in November 2022, but for months it remained an anonymous royal monument, suspended between architecture and identity. The mud had hidden the entrance. The broken stone inside hid the king. Before the 4 rooms could tell their story, they had to be excavated from what looked like the wreckage of the mountain itself. The mountain's wreckage did not conceal a single chamber but a damaged complex. C4 consists of 4 rooms connected by 2 corridors, arranged in a plan that seems modest beside the sprawling royal tombs of later New Kingdom kings. Its scale belongs to an earlier moment in the development of the Theban royal necropolis, when builders were still experimenting with how deeply to cut, how sharply to turn, and how to separate ritual space from the place where the king's body would rest. The architecture is more than a container for broken objects. It preserves a stage in the evolution of royal burial itself. The entrance staircase leads toward the first descending corridor, which carries the visitor away from daylight and into the rock. Beyond it, the rooms do not unfold with the clarity of a modern plan. Collapse and flood deposits distort distances, conceal floor levels, and interrupt the original sequence. Some doorways were approached through gaps in debris. In other places, the excavators stood above what appeared to be the floor, only to discover that they were working on compacted mud and stone lying far higher than the ancient pavement. The tomb had acquired a second interior, created by disaster. Chamber A dominates the complex. It is the largest of the 4 rooms and is widely interpreted as the probable burial chamber. That conclusion rests on its size, position, and relationship to the corridors, although the absence of a sarcophagus means the function cannot be demonstrated by the most obvious evidence. In an intact royal tomb, the stone coffin would anchor the room's meaning. Here, the chamber must be read through negative space, an area large enough for a royal interment, damaged decoration associated with the king's afterlife, and architectural features consistent with burial. but no surviving coffin to confirm where it stood. The ceiling above Chamber A had partially collapsed, sending limestone into the room and crushing or burying the material below. Water then carried fine sediment through the tomb, packing the gaps between larger stones. Repeated wetting and drying transformed parts of the deposit into a dense mass. Excavators describe material so firmly bonded that it behaved almost like concrete. This was not rubble that could be shoveled away. Each compacted section had to be reduced carefully, because a painted fragment or inscribed vessel piece might be trapped inside it. The force that destroyed the room also preserved clues by sealing them beyond later disturbance. The accumulated mud, limestone, and fallen plaster sometimes approach 2 meters in depth. That figure changes how the excavation must be imagined. The team was not simply clearing a floor, they were descending through a vertical record of collapse, flood, and ancient activity. A fragment found near the upper surface might have fallen from the ceiling, been carried there by water, or been displaced during an ancient removal. A piece recovered lower down was not automatically earlier. Flood deposits churn objects, while collapsing rock can drive later material beneath earlier layers. Stratigraphy remained essential, but it could not be interpreted as if the tomb had filled gently. The smaller chambers posed different problems. Their restricted spaces limited movement and made spoil removal difficult. Buckets, tools, lighting, recording equipment, and workers all had to share narrow passages where a careless step could damage a surface or destabilize stone. Airflow was poor, and the rock itself could not be assumed secure. Before archaeological questions could be answered, engineering judgments had to be made. Which blocks could be removed? Which required support could a ceiling edge be trusted? The tomb demanded patience, not only because evidence was delicate, but because the environment punished haste. One surprising feature was the discrepancy between the tomb's restrained dimensions and the richness implied by its decoration. Fragments of blue ceiling with yellow stars, traces of the Kerka pattern, and pieces of the Amduat showed that the rooms had once been transformed into a royal cosmos. The surviving architecture may appear austere now, but its plastered and painted surfaces would have dissolved the raw limestone beneath a controlled religious program. The burial chamber was not intended to feel like a cave. It was designed as the ordered night sky and underworld through which the dead king could pass toward renewal. The 4-room arrangement also raises questions about planning. Was C4 completed exactly as intended, or did the king's death force a shortened construction schedule? Thutmose II's reign may have been brief, and royal tomb building usually began early because death could not be scheduled. Yet the evidence remains incomplete. Damage has removed surfaces that might reveal changes in cutting, plastering, or decoration, and the later corridor complicates the original plan. Scholars still debate how much of C4 belongs to the first construction phase, and how much reflects emergency modification after the burial was threatened. That second corridor is one of the tomb's most consequential architectural clues, but its meaning becomes clearer only after the original rooms are understood. It enters Chamber A at a higher level than the floor, and its construction appears to belong to a later intervention. Its presence creates an oddity in the plan. A royal tomb normally controls movement through a formal approach. C4 eventually possessed another route, one that bypassed part of the original descent and reached the probable burial chamber from above. Whether it was designed for rescue, removal, or another purpose remains an interpretation rather than a recorded fact. The architecture therefore contains 2 stories layered together. The first is the planned tomb staircase, descending passage, connected rooms, decorated chamber, and a place prepared for royal burial. The second is the damaged monument collapsed ceiling, deep flood deposits, broken plaster, and an additional corridor cut into the complex. Excavation had to separate these stories without pretending they were cleanly divided. A wall might belong to the original burial while the sediment pressed against it came from a later flood. A doorway could preserve ancient plaster, but have been reopened during a removal. Every surface carried more than one phase. By the time Chamber A became accessible, the team could see the outline of a royal monument, but not its original appearance. Reconstruction depended on thousands of observations: the angle of a corridor, the depth of a deposit, the curvature of a vessel fragment, the position of painted plaster, and the relationship between one room and the next. No single observation explained C4. Together, they revealed a tomb built for order and transformed by catastrophe. The 4 rooms had once guided a dead king through a controlled sacred landscape. Now they guided archaeologists through the physical consequences of failure. The ceiling had fallen, the passages had filled, and the burial had disappeared. Yet on the fragments buried within Chamber A, a dark blue sky still held its yellow stars. The stars survived because the ceiling did not. When painted plaster broke away from the roof of Chamber A, fragments of an artificial night fell into the debris below. Some preserved a deep blue ground crossed by small yellow stars. Others carried bands of ornament or traces of figures and hieroglyphs. Separated from their original positions, they looked almost modest: a curved edge of colour, a few painted signs, a patch of blue no larger than a hand. Yet together they supplied the strongest early indication that C4 had been made for a king. In the early New Kingdom, such decoration was not simply beautiful. It was a coded architecture of resurrection. The blue ceiling transformed the burial chamber into the heavens. Yellow stars placed the dead rulers beneath an eternal sky that was also a divine body, a realm of order, and a rust of rebirth. Paint turned it into a celestial surface through which the king could join the gods. A royal burial chamber had to do more than contain a body. It had to remake the underground world into a place where death could be reversed. Fragments of a Keka frieze strengthened that interpretation. The Keka pattern appears as a repeated band of upright, bundled forms, often placed near the top of decorated walls. Its exact origin and symbolic development remain debated. It may preserve the memory of knotted plant material, bundled reeds, or architectural elements used in much earlier buildings. By the New Kingdom, it had become a conventional border marking the upper limits of sacred wall decoration. In C4, the surviving pieces revealed an organized decorative program. Stars occupied the ceiling, patterned borders framed the walls, and funerary texts filled the space below. The most decisive surviving text belonged to the Amduat, the composition whose modern title is usually translated as that which is in the underworld. It describes the sun god's journey through the 12 hours of night. Each hour presents a different region populated by gods, blessed dead, hostile beings, gates, caverns, boats, serpents, and forces that must be controlled. At sunset, the sun enters the western horizon and descends into darkness. During the night, it unites with the powers of the underworld, defeats threats to cosmic order, restores its exhausted energy, and emerges reborn in the east. It supplied a route into renewed existence. The Amduat did not function like a story told for entertainment. Its images and labels identified beings, places, dangers, and transformations. To know the underworld was to possess power within it. The text mapped the invisible realm and placed the king inside the sun god's cycle. Death became not a permanent halt but the western entrance to a repeating passage. Hour after hour, darkness moved toward dawn. The ruler's survival depended upon participating in that sequence, protected by correct names, images, and rituals. A painted figure was an active presence, a written name preserved identity. A scene from the night journey helped ensure that the king would not remain trapped in night. The composition is especially important because the earliest monumental versions of the Amduat are closely associated with the royal tombs of the 18th dynasty. Its appearance in C4 therefore helped narrow both date and status. Private tombs could contain sophisticated funerary imagery, but the full underworld program of this period belonged to kingship. The fragments did not yet reveal which king, but they showed that the owner had occupied the highest level of Egyptian ritual privilege. Before the throne name Aakheperenre could be reconstructed, the walls had already declared that the missing person was royal. Reconstructing that declaration was extraordinarily difficult. Floodwater had detached painted plaster from limestone, moved fragments between spaces, and abraded their surfaces. Some pieces had lost their painted face entirely. Others retained only lines too incomplete to identify without comparison to better preserved royal tombs. Specialists studied colour, line thickness, scale, curvature, and the direction in which signs faced. A small figure might belong to one of several hours. A line once horizontal could appear vertical after a fragment rotated in the collapse. Comparisons with early Amduat tombs were essential. The tombs associated with Thutmose II, Hatshepsut, Thutmose III, and other rulers preserve related traditions, though not identical copies. Artists adapted layouts to different chambers and available wall surfaces. Text could be written in cursive hieroglyphs, and figures were often rendered with a restrained, diagrammatic clarity rather than the richly modelled style familiar from later royal tombs. This visual economy suited the Amduat's purpose. It was a sacred map, not a courtly mural. C4's fragments belong to that early phase when the composition was becoming central to Theban royal burial. One lesser-known detail is that the Amduat's 12 hours were not equal divisions in the modern mechanical sense. They represented the ordered stages of nocturnal transformation. The middle of the night carried special importance, because it was there that the sun god's renewal reached its deepest point. The dead king's fate was bound to this cosmic process. Darkness was not empty space between sunsets and dawns. It was the workshop of regeneration. By painting the text inside a burial chamber, Egyptian builders placed the king within a universe where time itself repaired what death had broken. That belief gives the destroyed decoration an unexpected force. The tomb failed physically. Water entered, plaster fell, and the chamber's sacred order was shattered. Yet enough survived to reveal what its makers had attempted. They had enclosed Thutmose II, or the ruler later identified as Thutmose II, beneath a painted sky and surrounded him with the root of the sun. They expected the stone chamber to remain stable, the images to remain legible, and ritual knowledge to work eternally. Instead, the natural landscape invaded the artificial cosmos. Mud covered the underworld, limestone crushed the heavens, the yellow stars descended into darkness. Scholars still debate the exact placement and extent of C4's decorative scenes because so much remains fragmentary. Not every piece has been assigned with certainty, and conservation may continue to produce new joins. The evidence nevertheless establishes the central fact. C4 was not merely a high-status tomb or a chamber later used by royalty. Its decorative language was conceived for a pharaoh. The sky, the Keka border, and the Amduat formed a coordinated royal environment. Long before a complete throne name emerged, the tomb's broken universe had identified its rank. Someone had been buried here with the sun's 12-hour journey painted around him. The walls had been prepared to carry a king through the night in the silence beneath the western cliffs. The next problem was to discover which king those stars had once guarded. The stars established royal status, but they could not supply a name. That task fell to vessel fragments scattered through the deposits, pieces of alabaster or travertine once shaped into royal funerary containers. Their surfaces preserved incised hieroglyphs, but rarely complete ones. A curve of stone might carry half a cartouche. A small chip might preserve only the opening signs of a throne name. Another piece might contain a title belonging not to the dead king, but to the person who commissioned the object. Identity emerged not from one dramatic inscription, but from partial statements that had to be placed beside one another without forcing them to agree. The first promising signs seemed to point toward a ruler named Thutmose. That alone was not enough. Several early 18th dynasty kings shared that birth name, and their monuments occupied the same ritual landscape. Most difficult was the damaged throne name beginning with Aakhepe. Thutmose II bore Aakheperenre. Thutmose II bore Aakheperenre. When only the first portion survives, the distinction disappears. A fragment reading Aakheperenre could therefore lead toward either father or son. In a tomb damaged by flood and ancient disturbance, even a royal name could not automatically be assumed to identify the original owner. Objects moved. Burials were reorganized. Equipment was reused. A convincing attribution required the fragments, architecture, decoration, and historical relationships to converge. One of the smallest pieces proved disproportionately important, measuring only about 2 centimeters across. It preserved part of Hatshepsut's name and her title as Great Royal Wife. That title placed her before her own reign as Pharaoh, when she was queen beside Thutmose II. Hatshepsut was also the daughter of Thutmose III, so her appearance did not instantly eliminate the older king. Yet the combination changed the balance of probability. A royal burial containing objects that named Hatshepsut specifically as Great Royal Wife fit the funeral of her husband more naturally than the burial of her father. The clue did not solve the case, but it tightened the circle. The vessel forms added another layer. Among the recovered pieces were fragments from containers shaped like ducks and parts of larger jars. Such objects belonged to the material language of elite and royal burial, where food, oils, ointments, and symbolic offerings were placed with the dead. Their smooth, pale stone was expensive to quarry and difficult to work. In complete form, the vessels would have carried practical contents and ceremonial meaning. Broken and dispersed, they became documents. Their inscriptions recorded royal names, titles, and relationships that the tomb walls no longer preserved clearly enough. Month after month, the team cleaned and compared the fragments. Joins depended on more than matching broken edges. Stone grain, thickness, curvature, inscription depth, sign scale, and surface wear all had to correspond. 2 pieces might seem compatible because their hieroglyphs completed a familiar phrase, yet physical evidence could show that they came from different vessels. Conversely, fragments with no obvious textual connection could belong together because the curvature and mineral pattern aligned. The process demanded restraint. In archaeology, the desire for a solution can become a source of error when the expected name is already known. By 2023, the case for Thutmose II was strong enough to circulate among specialists, but the excavators continued looking for firmer proof. The crucial advance came on October 31st, 2024, exactly 2 years after the staircase had first been exposed. On that date, fragments could be joined to restore the full throne name Aakheperenre. The final signs mattered. Aakheperenre belonged to Thutmose II, not Thutmose I. What had been a persuasive argument now rested on a complete royal identifier recovered from the burial assemblage itself. Even then, careful interpretation remained necessary. A named object in a tomb does not always equal the tomb owner. Egyptian burial equipment could be moved, inherited, repurposed, or deposited during later restoration. Royal caches demonstrate how extensively priests transferred bodies and coffins long after the original funerals. But C4 contained more than one isolated item. The Amduat and celestial decoration established a king's tomb of the correct period. Multiple vessel fragments carried Aakheperenre. Hatshepsut appeared with the title appropriate to her position during Thutmose II's lifetime. The architecture fit an early New Kingdom royal burial, and no competing owner explained the full pattern as well. The official announcement in February 2025 therefore rested on cumulative evidence. It was not a sudden guess made for headlines, nor was it based solely on a cartouche discovered beside the entrance. The identification has been assembled from material recovered over more than 2 years. That distinction explains why the story unfolded slowly outside Egypt. Archaeologists had known that C4 was important long before the public could be told exactly whose tomb it was. The delay reflected the difference between suspicion and proof. The throne name itself carries the formal weight of Egyptian kingship. Aakheperenre is commonly rendered as something like great is the manifestation of Re, though translations of royal names can vary because they compress theology, grammar, and political meaning into a few signs. A pharaoh possessed several names, each expressing a different aspect of identity and rule. The birth name Thutmose linked him to the god Thoth. The throne name Aakheperenre proclaimed his divinely ordered royal existence. On monuments, these names were enclosed in cartouches, protecting and distinguishing the ruler. In C4 the cartouche had been broken, but not erased. There is a quiet irony in how the name survived. Monumental inscriptions were intended to outlast human memory, yet C4's walls were devastated. The king returned instead through shattered containers, objects once secondary to the body, coffin, and ritual equipment at the center of the burial. The grand architecture lost its label. The fragments carried it forward. What survives in the record also suggests that Hatshepsut's role was not incidental. Her titles on the vessels connected her directly to the burial arrangements, and the November 2025 excavation update added further pieces bearing Aakheperenre. The assemblage increasingly supported the conclusion that she organized or commissioned funerary equipment for her husband. This does not mean every object in C4 can be assigned to her hand, or every deposit can be linked securely to the tomb. The evidence remains incomplete, and some materials may relate to broader ritual activity within the Wadi. Still, the repeated association is difficult to dismiss. The fragments therefore solved one mystery while creating another. They identified the king who had once occupied the tomb, but they also preserved the presence of the woman who survived him and would later transform Egyptian kingship. Hatshepsut appears here before the crowns, colossal statues, and temple reliefs of her own reign. She appears as great royal wife, participating in the burial of Aakheperenre. To understand what these inscriptions imply, the investigation must turn from the broken name to the funeral they record. Hatshepsut's presence in C4 is not merely a name beside her husband's, it is the trace of an action. The vessel fragments suggest that she commissioned funerary equipment for Aakheperenre, the king known to history as Thutmose II. In the formal language of the period, she appears as Great Royal Wife, not yet as the female pharaoh who would later dominate Egypt's monuments. Here she stands at an earlier threshold, organizing rites for a dead husband and securing his passage into the next world. Royal burials were acts of state, theology, and succession, performed when one reign ended and another had to begin without allowing cosmic order to falter. The strongest new evidence came from a feature discovered 14 meters from C4. Excavators uncovered an intact pit containing the remains of a young bovine, 2 water jars, and a vessel intended for ointment. Deposits of this kind could mark the founding or sanctification of a sacred construction. Animals, food, liquids, tools, pottery, and inscribed objects might be placed beneath or near a monument to establish it ritually before building began. Once sealed, such deposits could remain undisturbed even when the monument they serve was robbed or damaged. The pit near C4 had this power. It preserved a controlled group of objects in a landscape where almost everything else had been displaced. The ointment vessel carried the most compelling inscription. It stated that Hatshepsut had made the object for Aakheperenre, whom the text described through the Egyptian royal kinship expression commonly rendered as her brother. In royal language, brother could also refer to a husband, especially within a dynastic marriage. The wording therefore fits Hatshepsut making a funerary offering for Thutmose II. Combined with the vessel fragments from C4, the inscription strengthens the conclusion that she directed or sponsored elements of his burial. It also places her at the center of the funeral before she assumed the full visual and titulary language of kingship herself. Yet the pit creates a caution, as well as a connection. The excavation team has acknowledged that it need not be a foundation deposit belonging directly to C4. 14 meters is close in the scale of a wadi, but proximity alone cannot prove architectural ownership. The deposit may have sanctified a broader stretch of the valley. It may have related to another funerary monument whose entrance has not yet been found. It might belong to a later stage in the handling of Thutmose II's burial rather than the first cutting of C4. Archaeology often preserves ritual acts more clearly than the precise building to which those acts belonged. This ambiguity matters because foundation deposits usually gain meaning from location. When found beneath a corner, threshold, or wall, their relationship to a structure can be compelling. A sealed pit standing apart from a known monument is harder to assign. The landscape around C4 contains disturbed ground, ancient construction activity, and the possibility of additional burial architecture. The pit's contents unmistakably connect Hatshepsut and Aakheperenre with ritual work in the wadi, but no single explanation fully accounts for why the deposit lies where it does. It can support a burial narrative without settling every stage of that narrative. The young bovine adds another layer. Cattle carried associations of nourishment, wealth, fertility, sacrifice, and divine power. In a foundation or consecration context, the animal could embody the provisioning of a sacred place and the transfer of life force to a monument intended for the dead. The 2 jars of water may have supplied purification or symbolic sustenance, while ointment belonged to bodily care, ritual anointing, and the preservation of royal identity. These were ordinary substances elevated by placement and inscription. Water, fat, stone, clay, and an animal offering became part of the machinery through which eternity was prepared. What survives suggests that Hatshepsut's participation was both personal and institutional. As great royal wife, she occupied the highest female office at court. She carried dynastic legitimacy through her descent from Thutmose II, and she stood beside a husband whose own position may have depended partly on marriage into that line. At his death, her authority did not disappear. She was ideally placed to supervise the rituals, resources, craftsmen, and officials required for a royal funeral. The burial of a king demanded quarrying, transport, embalming, coffins, vessels, textiles, food, incense, protective objects, liturgy, and guarded movement through the necropolis. Even a comparatively modest tomb represented a national concentration of skill and wealth. It is tempting to read this funeral backward through the knowledge that Hatshepsut later ruled as Pharaoh. That can distort the scene. Nothing in the C4 fragments proves that she was already planning to seize or transform royal power. The evidence presents her in the accepted role of a queen preparing for her husband's burial. Her later career makes the moment more resonant, but it should not turn every funerary object into a political manifesto. At the same time, the burial would have placed her close to the central institutions of kingship at a moment of transition. Ritual responsibility and political authority were never entirely separate in Egypt. Thutmose II's death created a delicate succession. The male heir, Thutmose III, was young, while Hatshepsut possessed royal blood, experience, and the title of God's wife of Amun, as well as great royal wife. The funeral therefore unfolded under conditions in which continuity had to be displayed with particular force. The dead king had to be transformed into an eternal ruler, while the living court affirmed that kingship remained stable. Hatshepsut's gifts to Aakheperenre served the deceased, but they also participated in the public and sacred management of succession. The precise sequence remains uncertain. Thutmose II may first have been buried in C4 with equipment commissioned under Hatshepsut's authority. Flood damage may then have made the tomb unsafe, forcing officials to remove the body and major objects. A second burial place may have been prepared elsewhere in the same wadi. Each step is plausible, and parts of the architecture support such a reconstruction. But no surviving Egyptian text narrates the operation from beginning to end. The intact pit proves ritual activity. The inscriptions prove association. The later removal remains an archaeological inference. Even so, Hatshepsut is no longer a shadow hovering vaguely over the tomb. Her title is cut into stone connected with the burial. Her name appears in material recovered from the wreckage and in a sealed deposit nearby. She made something for Aakheperenre, and that simple act survives more clearly than the fate of the king's body. The woman who would become one of Egypt's most remarkable rulers first enters this mystery not upon a throne, but beside a funeral, and the husband she buried remains difficult to see, obscured between the greatness of his father, the power of his wife, and the conquests of the successor who followed them. Thutmose II is easiest to lose when the dynasty is viewed from a distance. Behind him stands Thutmose II, the soldier king who carried Egyptian power deep into Nubia. Beside him stands Hatshepsut, whose regency and eventual kingship produced a remarkable reign. After him comes Thutmose III, the ruler celebrated for campaigns, administration, and an empire at its widest reach. Between these figures, Thutmose II can seem like a connective name, a brief bridge in a family tree rather than a pharaoh with a life, a court, and a burial of his own. C4 changes that impression by forcing attention back onto the man whose absence helped create the mystery. He was born into the ruling house of the 18th dynasty, but his position was not as simple as that of an undisputed crown prince. Thutmose II appears to have fathered him with Mutnofret, a royal woman often identified as a secondary wife rather than the great royal wife who bore Hatshepsut. This distinction mattered in a court where bloodline, maternal status, marriage, and political support shaped legitimacy. Thutmose II was a king's son, but Hatshepsut possessed prestigious descent through her parents. Their marriage joined two branches of the royal family and may have strengthened his claim, although no contemporary explanation of its political purpose survives. Modern retellings often flatten this relationship into a simple formula: an obscure husband overshadowed by an ambitious wife. The reality was likely more complicated. Hatshepsut held exceptional titles and ritual authority, but during Thutmose II's reign she was represented as queen. Surviving monuments show the pair participating in royal convention, with the pharaoh occupying the central male office and Hatshepsut performing the powerful role of great royal wife. That arrangement did not make her insignificant, nor does her later rise prove that her husband had been politically irrelevant. Egyptian royal power depended upon temples, administrators, military officers, priests, and family alliances. Even a ruler who left fewer monuments stood at the center of that system while he lived. The difficulty is that Thutmose II's reign is poorly illuminated. Later rulers built on the same sacred sites, recut inscriptions, moved blocks, restored damaged names, and absorbed earlier structures into new monuments. Hatshepsut and Thutmose III both commanded building programs far larger than anything securely attributed to him. Their cartouches and images dominate the surviving landscape, while his appear on scattered blocks and objects whose original contexts are not always clear. The imbalance of evidence can become an illusion of personality. A small archaeological footprint does not necessarily mean a passive king. It may reflect a short reign, incomplete projects, later rebuilding, or accidents of preservation. His father's shadow is especially long. Thutmose I helped define the confidence of the new dynasty. He expanded royal building at Karnak, asserted control in the south, and was remembered as a formidable ruler. He also belongs to the formative history of royal burial in Western Thebes, where tomb locations and attributions remain complicated. Because the damaged throne name from c4 initially began only with Aakheperenre, Thutmose II was not merely a historical comparison, he was a genuine alternative candidate. Father and son were close enough in date, titulary, and funerary tradition that broken fragments could blur their identities more than 3,000 years later. Hatshepsut's shadow falls differently because she survived Thutmose II and reshaped the memory of the family. She first acted on behalf of Thutmose III, then adopted the full titles and visual presentation of a pharaoh. Her temple at Deir el-Bahari, colossal statuary, obelisks, reliefs, and royal ideology gave her a monumental presence that Thutmose II never approached. Later attempts to alter parts of her royal image added another layer of fascination. She became both a visible ruler and a historical mystery. In that story, her husband was often reduced to the man whose death opened the path to her power. Yet the objects from c4 reveal a more grounded connection. Hatshepsut's title as Great Royal Wife appears on material associated with his burial, and the nearby ritual deposit records that she made an offering for Aakheperenre. Whatever their personal relationship may have been, she acted to secure his royal afterlife. The evidence does not give access to affection, grief, rivalry, or private intention. It gives titles, objects, and ritual responsibility. Those may seem emotionally silent, but in Egyptian terms they were powerful acts. To preserve a king's name and equip his burial was to help maintain his existence. The shadow of Thutmose III is more paradoxical. He succeeded Thutmose II but was not the son of Hatshepsut. His mother was Iset, another woman of the royal household. Hatshepsut's daughter, Neferua, became prominent during the years that followed, while Hatshepsut herself exercised authority first as regent and later as king. Thutmose III eventually ruled for decades and left abundant evidence of military, religious, and administrative activity. His achievements made the brief reign before him appear smaller still, but his legitimacy was tied directly to Thutmose II, the father from whom he inherited the throne. The obscure king was essential to the succession that produced one of Egypt's most famous pharaohs. Even Thutmose II's surviving images resist certainty. Statues and reliefs attributed to him can be difficult to separate from those of nearby reigns, especially when names are damaged or surfaces were altered. Royal art was designed to express office more than individual appearance. A pharaoh's idealized face communicated youth, strength, and divine order, not necessarily recognizable portraiture. The mummy traditionally identified as Thutmose II seems to offer a physical body, yet that identification is disputed and belongs to another layer of the mystery. For now, the king remains easier to trace through relationships than through features son of Thutmose I, husband of Hatshepsut, father of Thutmose III. Scholars still debate how much authority each member of this royal family exercised at particular moments, because the surviving record was shaped by later political needs as well as ancient damage. It is dangerous to turn gaps into certainty. Thutmose II may have been young or mature, forceful or dependent, healthy or unwell when he became king. The evidence cannot support a complete psychological portrait. What it can show is that he occupied a crucial dynastic junction. His marriage consolidated royal lines, his death triggered an unusual succession, and his burial drew Hatshepsut into the Wadi where C4 was prepared. The tomb restores scale to a ruler diminished by comparison. Thutmose II did not need to surpass his father, wife, or son to matter. His reign connected theirs, and his disappearance shaped the archaeology of the dynasty. The next question is why his own years on the throne left so little behind. The answer begins with a reign whose length is uncertain, and with a historical record that flickers into view only briefly before going dark. The darkness surrounding Thutmose II's reign is not caused by an absence of evidence. It is caused by evidence that refuses to settle into one clear chronology. Traditional reconstructions often gave him roughly 13 or 14 years. More recent reassessments have argued for a much shorter reign, perhaps only 3 to 5 years. That difference changes how old he may have been when he died, how much time was available to cut and decorate C4, how many military and building projects can be assigned to him, and how the traditional mummy identification should be judged. Egyptian chronology rarely survives as a continuous royal diary. Regnal years appear on inscriptions, administrative documents, quarry marks, and monuments, but those records are uneven. A king's highest securely attested year does not always reveal the full length of his rule. Documents can be lost, dates damaged, and material once attributed to one ruler reassigned. Thutmose II stands near the beginning of a comparatively well-studied dynasty, yet his own duration remains disputed because the dated evidence is thin and sometimes indirect. Scholars still debate whether later chronological traditions preserve a genuine long reign or inflate a kingship that ended quickly. A short reign would explain much of his faint monumental presence. Royal construction did not begin and end with a single ruler. Temples accumulated additions across generations, blocks were reused, reliefs recut, and unfinished projects completed under successors. At Karnak, where nearly every pharaoh sought visibility, traces associated with Thutmose II survive but are overwhelmed by the works of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III. Other activity has been connected with Elephantine, Semna, and Kuma, strategic and sacred sites in the south. Some attributions are secure, while others depend on fragments removed from their original setting. The result is a reign visible in pieces, much like the tomb itself. The clearest military event placed in his first regnal year concerns Nubia. An uprising broke out in the south, and Egyptian forces were dispatched to restore control. The surviving account follows the formal language of royal victory, presenting the king as the source of authority even if he did not personally lead the expedition. Egyptian inscriptions often describe military success as the pharaoh's action, because every campaign was ideologically his, whether he stood on the battlefield or commanded through officials. The text therefore demonstrates a political crisis and royal response, but it is not a modern operational report. Nubia was essential to the early 18th dynasty. It controlled routes, gold resources, labour, cattle, and access farther into Africa. Thutmose II had pushed Egyptian power beyond earlier limits, leaving his successor responsible for holding an expanded frontier. Rebellion during Thutmose II's first year may indicate how fragile that control remained. Conquest was not a single moment after which a region became permanently obedient. Garrisons, administrators, local alliances, tribute systems, and repeated displays of force were required. Even a brief reign could contain serious military activity when inherited territories tested a new ruler. Another campaign is associated with shasu groups, a broad Egyptian term used for mobile pastoral populations east and northeast of Egypt. The details are less certain than popular summaries imply. Surviving references do not allow a complete reconstruction of where the operation occurred, how extensive it was, or whether Thutmose II participated directly. Shasu was not the name of one unified nation, and Egyptian sources compressed diverse communities into categories useful to the state. What survives suggests an operation connected with desert routes or frontier security, but no single explanation fully accounts for its context. These military fragments complicate the image of a weak or inactive king. They show that the machinery of empire continued under his name. Yet they do not prove a long reign or an energetic personal commander. Royal ideology magnified success and concealed failure. A ruler known from 2 campaigns might have spent years governing, or he might have died soon after officials carried out urgent operations on inherited frontiers. The evidence supports activity, not a complete biography. The monuments are equally ambiguous. At Karnak, inscriptions and blocks bearing his names indicate participation in the expanding cult complex of Amun. In Nubia, works at Semna and Kuma connected royal authority with fortified control of the Nile corridor. Elephantine, near Egypt's southern boundary, also preserved signs of royal attention. These locations mark the religious and strategic architecture of the state Amun's great temple at Thebes, the southern frontier, and the river channels through which goods and armies moved. Even limited projects placed Thutmose II within the imperial geography, shaped by his father and enlarged by his successors. One surprising possibility is that the apparent smallness of his reign partly results from later success rather than contemporary failure. Hatshepsut's building program transformed Karnak and western Thebes. Thutmose III then ruled long enough to cover the landscape with his own records. Their monuments did not merely stand beside those of Thutmose II, they altered the context in which his works survived. A short-lived construction could disappear into foundations, be dismantled for reusable stone, or become anonymous once its cartouches were damaged. Historical obscurity can be created by the abundance of later evidence. The uncertain reign length reaches directly into C4. If Thutmose II ruled only 3 or 4 years, the tomb may have been cut, plastered, and decorated under intense time pressure. Its compact architecture could reflect that urgency. Although flood destruction makes the original state difficult to assess, if he ruled closer to 14 years, then the tomb's modest scale requires another explanation. Perhaps C4 was one phase in a more complicated burial plan. Perhaps royal tomb architecture in the Western Wadis followed priorities not yet understood. The building cannot be used as a simple stopwatch. It also affects the disputed mummy. A man who became king young and died after only a few years might be expected to have died relatively young. The body labelled CG 61066 has traditionally been estimated at around 30 years old, though biological age estimates from ancient remains are imprecise. A longer reign makes that age easier to reconcile. A shorter one sharpens the problem but does not solve it, because the king's age at accession is uncertain. Chronology, osteology, and genealogy form a circle in which each uncertain answer influences the others. Thutmose II's reign therefore remains a narrow bridge suspended over gaps. There was a Nubian revolt, probable action against Shasu groups, construction at major religious and frontier sites, a queen of unusual status, and a young successor whose future would reshape Egypt. Yet the number of years holding these events together is still debated. The king's history survives not as a continuous story, but as fixed points separated by darkness. That darkness would soon become literal in the Western Desert, where a tomb intended for eternity lay directly in the path of water. The water waiting above C4 did not belong to the desert most people imagine. Today, the Western Wadis appear stripped to their essentials: pale limestone, loose gravel, blinding light, and channels that seem too dry to have carried anything more dangerous than wind. Yet this landscape has not always been uniformly arid. Over thousands of years, rainfall patterns shifted, brief wet phases returned, and storms sent water racing through valleys that remained dry for long intervals. A tomb could stand untouched for years, then be struck in a single night by a flood powerful enough to move stone. This is one of the central paradoxes of the Theban necropolis. The Western Desert offered concealment, isolation, and distance from cultivated land, all qualities suited to royal burial. At the same time, the wadis were natural drainage systems. Their steep sides collected runoff and directed it toward narrow channels. When rain fell on bare limestone, little vegetation slowed the flow. Water gathered quickly, carrying mud, gravel, and broken rock downhill. A place that looked secure in ordinary weather could become a funnel during an exceptional storm. The early New Kingdom was not a permanently wet age, and it would be misleading to picture green valleys surrounding C4. The region was already desert, but geoarchaeological evidence indicates episodes of greater moisture than the landscape experiences now, along with repeated flash flood activity. Ancient channels, sediment layers, and water-shaped deposits preserve a history invisible from the modern surface. The evidence remains incomplete because later erosion cuts through earlier layers, but it is clear that rainfall was neither impossible nor irrelevant to those who built in Western Thebes. The wetter intervals need not have lasted for generations to leave consequences. A sequence of unusually strong storms within a few years could alter a slope, open a new channel, or fill an entrance that had seemed safely placed. Desert hydrology is episodic by nature. Long stillness hides the scale of the next event, and the absence of recent flooding can encourage precisely the confidence that a rare storm later punishes. Some parts of the broader landscape appear to have held temporary pools or small bodies of water after storms. Fine sediments settled where flow slowed, while coarser material accumulated in channels. Mud-built structures and natural deposits record cycles of wetting and drying. Even insect remains can become environmental evidence. Mud nests made by bees or wasps require access to workable moisture, and their presence in sheltered places can indicate conditions different from the absolute dryness visitors see today. Such clues are small, but they help reconstruct a desert that occasionally came alive with water. The Egyptians were not ignorant of this danger. Across the Theban necropolis, they altered drainage, cut channels, built retaining features, and sometimes constructed dams or barriers intended to divert runoff away from sacred and inhabited areas. These interventions show that water management formed part of funerary planning. Builders understood that a valley was not an inert backdrop. It was a system through which rare but destructive flows moved. Yet understanding a hazard does not guarantee protection from every event, especially when decisions are made under pressure and rainfall can exceed remembered experience. Why, then, was C4 placed where it was? The simplest answer is that its builders considered the site acceptable when construction began. They may have judged the channel inactive, believed the entrance lay above the most dangerous flow, or assumed that protective measures elsewhere would be sufficient. The topography may also have looked different. Ancient surfaces have been buried, cut, and reshaped, while collapses change the routes followed by runoff. The exact appearance of Wadi C during Thutmose II's reign cannot be restored with confidence. There may also have been symbolic or political reasons to choose the area. The Western Wadis already held royal associations, and burial near members of the dynasty could have mattered. Seclusion was valuable, while the branching valley offered natural concealment from anyone approaching from the Nile. A tomb location was never selected by geology alone. Ritual geography, family precedent, available labour, security, and the king's time remaining all influenced the decision. If Thutmose II's death came early, officials may have accepted risks they would otherwise have avoided. One lesser-known possibility is that the valley's relationship with water may not initially have been regarded only as a threat. Water in Egyptian religion carried renewal, fertility, purification, and rebirth. The Western Desert represented the realm of death, but death itself was expected to lead toward regeneration. This does not mean the builders deliberately placed a royal tomb in a flood path. There is no evidence for such a reckless symbolic choice. It does mean that the cultural meaning of water was more complex than modern engineering language suggests. The same substance that sustained life could erase the architecture of eternity. The Nile shaped Egyptian thinking because its predictable inundation renewed the fields. Desert floods were different. They were irregular, violent, and difficult to control. Instead of spreading fertile silt across prepared land, they compressed water and debris into narrow channels. A royal necropolis situated beyond the floodplain escaped the annual river rise, but remained exposed to sudden storms from the high desert. The builders traded one kind of hydrological danger for another. C4 appears to have suffered that trade more severely than most. The tomb entrance lay in a position where runoff could descend toward it. Once water crossed the threshold, The sloping corridor helped direct the flow inward. Mud and stone moved down the passage, gaining access to the rooms below. Chamber A, intended as the protected centre of the burial, became a basin where sediment accumulated. Painted plaster absorbed moisture, detached, and fell. Ceiling rock weakened and collapsed. The architecture designed to guide ritual movement also guided destruction. It is possible that more than one flood entered the tomb. Sediment and structural damage may represent separate episodes rather than a single catastrophe. Excavators have proposed that a decisive event occurred within roughly 6 years of the burial, but that estimate should be understood as their interpretation of the archaeological sequence, not a precisely dated storm recorded in an ancient chronicle. No surviving text states the year when water entered C4. The timing is inferred from the apparent response, the modifications to the tomb, and the condition of the burial. The landscape therefore becomes an active participant in the mystery. Thutmose II's tomb was not simply robbed and forgotten. It was built inside a valley with a long environmental memory, one that human planners could read only imperfectly. For most days, Wadi C was silent and dry. Then clouds gathered somewhere above the limestone. Water found the ancient channels, and the desert changed its character. The next stage of the story begins when that moving water reached the staircase and turned a royal chamber into a trap. The first surge may have announced itself as a distant collision of water and stone moving through the wadi. Then the channel above C4 would have filled with runoff, mud, gravel, and broken limestone. The staircase that once carried priests and bearers downward became a chute. Water crossed the entrance, entered the descending passage, and drove debris toward the rooms below. In the probable burial chamber, the painted universe of the king met a force that had no regard for ritual order. What happened next must be reconstructed from damage. There is no ancient text describing the storm, no report recording the tomb's failure, and no surviving witness to explain how quickly the crisis unfolded. The evidence lies in silt, collapse, watermarks, displaced plaster, and dense deposits later excavators cut apart by hand. These traces show that C4 was not merely dampened by seepage. It was invaded by moving water powerful enough to carry material deep underground and alter the structure of the tomb. Mud entered first as a fluid mass, filling low spaces and spreading across floors. As the water slowed, heavier stones settled while fine sediment packed the gaps between them. Repeated drying hardened the mixture. Later, moisture may have activated the deposit again, allowing it to move, compress, and bind more tightly. In places, the final result behaved almost like concrete. The ancient flood had created its own architecture inside the royal monument. Walls and platforms of compacted debris where open rooms had once existed. The decoration was especially vulnerable. Painted plaster depended on adhesion between the prepared surface and the limestone behind it. Water weakened that bond. Salts could migrate through the wall, crystallize, and force painted layers outward. Mud pressed against scenes of the Amduat. Fragments from the star ceiling detached and dropped into the accumulating fill. Some pieces may have floated or shifted before becoming trapped far from their original positions. Others were crushed beneath falling rock. The destruction did not erase the decorative program completely, but it broke the sacred sequence into hundreds of disconnected remnants. The ceiling also began to fail. Limestone in the Theban hills is not uniform. Natural fractures, weaker layers, and faults can remain stable until water changes the pressure within them or removes supporting material below. Once sections fell, their weight shattered plaster, vessels, and anything left on the floor. Additional collapse may have occurred long after the first flood, making it difficult to separate immediate catastrophe from centuries of structural decay. What survives in the record suggests a sequence rather than one clean event: water entered, deposits accumulated, surfaces failed, and the chamber continued to deteriorate. The excavation team has proposed that the decisive flood struck within about 6 years of Thutmose II's burial. This is a powerful detail, but it remains an archaeological interpretation rather than an exact historical date. It depends on how the tomb's alterations, remaining objects, and later access route are understood. If the estimate is broadly correct, C4 failed almost immediately by the standards of a monument intended to endure forever. The burial may barely have passed from ceremony into memory before officials faced the possibility that the king's body and equipment could not safely remain there. Such a crisis would have been theological as well as practical. A royal mummy was not regarded as an abandoned corpse. It was the protected physical center of rites that preserved identity and supported transformation. Coffins, amulets, linens, canopic equipment, food offerings, and inscribed vessels were parts of an integrated system. Floodwater threatened not only valuable objects but the king's continued existence in the form his burial had been designed to sustain. Removing him from the tomb could therefore become an act of preservation rather than desecration. Yet an emergency rescue would have been difficult. The body may have rested within nested wooden coffins, perhaps accompanied by a stone sarcophagus too large to move through a damaged route. Heavy equipment could not simply be lifted over deep mud and collapsed blocks. Workers needed access, light, ropes, supports, and enough secure ground to carry fragile objects through confined passages. If the original corridor was obstructed or dangerous, another path might have been necessary. The later high-level passage entering Chamber A begins to make sense against this background. Still, flood damage does not explain every absence. Water can break vessels, detach plaster, and bury objects, but it does not neatly remove a mummy, coffins, and the majority of portable funerary equipment. Human intervention is required somewhere in the sequence. The central question is whether that intervention occurred soon after the flood, as an organized royal transfer, or much later through robbery, salvage, and repeated clearance. No single explanation fully accounts for everything. An early rescue and later stripping are not mutually exclusive. Ancient robbers were capable of entering damaged tombs and removing materials of value. Gold fittings could be torn from coffins, oils emptied, wood reused, and stone objects carried away. Officials in later periods also dismantled royal burials for protection, transferring bodies and reusing coffins when the necropolis became insecure. C4 may have experienced several phases of handling. The flood could have forced the first removal, while later generations reduced what remained. By the time the entrance disappeared beneath debris, the tomb may already have been emptied of its most recognizable royal contents. One surprising aspect of the evidence is that destruction may have preserved the tomb from total erasure. The same hardened deposits that made excavation painfully slow sealed small fragments beyond the reach of later visitors. Robbers seek complete vessels, metal, wood, and objects that can be carried or sold. Tiny inscribed chips embedded in flood sediment have little immediate value. Those overlooked remnants eventually identified the king. Catastrophe destroyed the burial's visible splendor, but protected enough documentary evidence to return its name. The flood therefore stands at the center of the mystery without solving it. It explains why the chamber collapsed, why decoration lies in fragments, and why emergency action may have been necessary. It does not tell us exactly when the king left, which objects accompanied him, or where the transfer ended. Scholars still debate whether C4 was abandoned after one overwhelming event or after repeated episodes of damage. The geological record can reveal force and sequence, but it cannot supply intention. Inside Chamber A, the consequences remain stark. The blue ceiling became rubble. The Amduat lost its ordered hours. Mud rose where the sarcophagus should have anchored eternity. A tomb built to isolate the king from change was transformed within years, perhaps within a single season, by the ancient landscape surrounding it. Once the water withdrew, officials faced a decision no royal architect intended them to make, whether to repair the ruined house of eternity or cut a new route and carry the pharaoh out. The decision appears to have left a scar in the architecture. A second corridor was cut into C4 after the original tomb had been completed, entering Chamber A at a point higher than the ancient floor. It does not follow the formal descent prepared for the funeral. Instead, it approaches the probable burial chamber from above, as though its builders needed a route that avoided the lower, damaged passage, in a tomb already choked by mud and fallen stone. That difference in height may preserve the logic of an emergency. The corridor was not a rough opening hacked through the rock and abandoned. Its surfaces were plastered, and evidence suggests that it was enlarged during use. It was also closed, reopened, and closed again. Those phases make the passage difficult to explain as the work of ordinary robbers. Tomb thieves usually sought the fastest access to valuable objects. They could cut irregular tunnels, squeeze through breaches, and show little concern for finishing walls or resealing an entrance. The second corridor at C4 appears more deliberate and controlled. The excavation team therefore interprets it as a rescue passage. Under this reconstruction, floodwater had filled the original approach and deposited so much debris that the normal route to Chamber A became unusable or dangerous. Workers cut a higher entrance into the burial chamber, widened it enough to move people and equipment, and removed the king along with whatever funerary objects could be saved. Once the operation ended, they sealed the route. A later reopening may indicate that the transfer took place in stages, that officials returned for additional material, or that another intervention occurred after the first closure. This explanation fits several pieces of evidence. It accounts for the absence of the mummy, coffins, stone sarcophagus, and major burial equipment. It explains why a secondary route enters the chamber above the deepest flood deposits. It also matches the possibility that C4 became unsafe only a few years after the funeral, while royal officials still had the resources and motivation to arrange another burial. If Hatshepsut supervised the original interment, she may also have ordered the rescue, though no surviving inscription states that she did. The process would have required more than carrying a body through a tunnel. A royal mummy could be enclosed within several coffins, surrounded by linen, amulets, resin, floral material, and protective equipment. Some objects were portable, others were heavy or fragile. A large stone sarcophagus, if one had been installed, may have been impossible to remove once the original corridor was blocked. It could have been broken, abandoned, or never completed. But no surviving fragments allow certainty. The absence of a sarcophagus is significant without revealing exactly what happened to it. Moving the king also required a destination. A temporary chamber might protect the burial while a new tomb was prepared. An existing family tomb could have been adapted. Officials might have transferred only the mummy and the most sacred objects, leaving damaged or replaceable equipment behind. Another possibility is that the body was moved more than once. First during the early flood crisis, and again centuries later, when priests gathered royal mummies into hidden caches. The corridor survives, but not the itinerary. The plastering of the passage is one of its most intriguing features. Finishing a corridor consumed time and labour, suggesting that it was meant to function as more than a momentary breach. Plaster could stabilise rough surfaces, reduce damage to objects being moved, or prepare the passage for closure. Yet plaster alone does not prove official activity. Skilled tomb robbers sometimes operated with inside knowledge, and later restorers could alter an earlier illicit tunnel. Scholars still debate how confidently architecture can reveal the identity of the people who used it. Independent caution is therefore necessary. The corridor strongly supports organised removal, but it does not prove that every missing object left during one rescue. Even if royal officials carried Thutmose II out soon after the flood, the abandoned tomb may later have been reopened. Remaining metal fittings could be stripped, wooden objects might decay or be removed for reuse, stone vessels could be smashed, and portable pieces dispersed. A rescue event and later robbery can occupy the same history. Choosing between them may create a simplicity the evidence does not deserve. The sequence of closures reinforces this complexity. A sealed passage suggests an effort to restore security after access. A second opening suggests that the first intervention was not final. Perhaps workers underestimated how much equipment remained. Perhaps the new burial location was not ready, forcing a temporary arrangement. Perhaps later officials entered to retrieve ritual objects or inspect the damaged chamber. Or perhaps robbers eventually breached a route originally made by royal workmen. No ancient text labels each phase, and the plastered surfaces preserve no readable timetable. What survives suggests that the removal was purposeful. The tomb was not simply abandoned with the king trapped beneath collapse. Someone reached Chamber A after the disaster and created a workable path. The route was high enough to bypass material lying on the floor and broad enough to permit repeated movement. That changes the character of C4. The emptiness was not produced only by anonymous destruction. It may preserve the aftermath of an organised effort to save a royal burial from a monument that had failed. Such a rescue would not have been unprecedented in principle. Egyptian officials repeatedly moved sacred and royal objects when tombs were threatened. During later periods, priests transferred kings from vulnerable burials and eventually assembled groups of mummies in concealed caches. Those operations show that a tomb could be abandoned without abandoning the person buried within it. The physical location of a royal body was less important than preserving ritual identity. Names, wrappings, and protection. If C4 became dangerous, removal could be understood as maintaining eternity by changing its address. Yet the second corridor does not reveal where that new address lay. It points outward from Chamber A and then ends in uncertainty. The passage tells us that movement occurred, but not what was carried, who supervised it, or whether the destination survived intact. It is a piece of evidence shaped like an escape route, leading from a known tomb toward an unknown one. By the time the corridor was sealed for the last time, C4 had ceased to function as the complete burial its builders intended. The painted underworld remained on broken walls. Vessel fragments bearing Aakheperenre stayed in the debris. The king, however, was no longer there. Somewhere beyond the damaged chamber, officials may have carried his wrapped body into the desert, beginning a journey whose final stage is still disputed. The next surviving body associated with his name would not emerge from Wadi Sea, but from a hidden royal cache discovered more than 3,000 years later. The body traditionally identified as Thutmose II did not come from C4. It came from another place, another century of royal anxiety, and another archaeological story. In 1881, a hidden cache of royal mummies was revealed at Deir el-Bahri, in the tomb now known as DB320. Priests of a later age had gathered kings, queens, and members of the royal family into this refuge after repeated robbery threatened the necropolis. Among them was a mummy eventually catalogued as CG 6166 and presented under the name Thutmose II. That identification rests mainly on ancient labels and coffin evidence. The body had been rewrapped, and its burial equipment was no longer the original ensemble prepared at death. During the 21st dynasty, officials restored royal mummies, replaced damaged wrappings, reused coffins, and wrote dockets identifying the person they believed they were protecting. These inscriptions matter. They were produced by priests handling royal remains within a tradition that preserved names and burial histories. Yet they are separated from the original funeral by centuries of disturbance. The coffin associated with CG 61066 raises further questions because it appears to have been reused. Royal mummies in the caches were not always found inside coffins made for them. Robbery and restoration had broken the original relationship between body and equipment. Priests worked with what remained, transferring individuals into available coffins and adding identifying notes. This practice saved many royal bodies, but it also created the possibility of ancient error, a name written during reburial records what restorers believed, not necessarily what modern science can independently prove. The mummy itself has often been described as a relatively young adult male, perhaps around 30 years old, though estimates vary. The body is poorly preserved in places and shows damage associated with ancient robbery and later handling. Age at death is reconstructed from skeletal development, tooth wear, joint surfaces, and other biological indicators. These methods provide ranges rather than exact birthdays. Preservation, disease, individual variation, and the limits of older examinations can shift the result. Biological age cannot be read like a cartouche. This uncertainty matters because some recent reconstructions give Thutmose II only 3 or 4 years on the throne. If he became king while still young, a body near 30 might seem too old. The C4 excavation team has therefore questioned whether CG 61066 is really Thutmose II. Their argument is not based on age alone. They also note irregularities in the names written on the coffin and wrappings, and consider whether later restorers confused the king with another royal individual. A short reign, young accession, and problematic labels create a genuine identification problem. But each element contains assumptions. Thutmose II's age when he became king is unknown. His reign may have lasted longer than the shortest chronologies suggest. The estimate of 30 years for the mummy is not absolute. The placement of names on reused burial material may reflect restoration practice rather than mistaken identity. When uncertain chronology is compared with uncertain osteology, apparent contradiction can look stronger than it is. Scholars still debate the balance because no single test has produced an answer independent of the archaeological record. The traditional identification also has an important advantage: it is ancient. The priests who reburied the body were much closer to the 18th dynasty than modern investigators. Even if centuries separated them from Thutmose II, they may have had access to tomb records, coffin inscriptions, temple archives, or inherited knowledge now lost. The royal cache was not assembled randomly. Many individuals can be connected with known rulers through inscriptions, family relationships, and physical evidence. To dismiss every docket as unreliable would remove one of the most important sources for reconstructing Egypt's royal dead. Ancient experts could still make mistakes. The cache operations occurred during institutional stress. Tombs had been robbed, coffins broken, bodies stripped, and identifying objects displaced. Workmen may have encountered mummies already moved from their original locations. Names could be copied from damaged linen, read incorrectly, or attached to the wrong restored body. Some royal identifications remain controversial precisely because the priests were preserving a disrupted archive made of human remains. Modern genetics seems like an obvious solution, but the reality is difficult. Ancient DNA from Egyptian mummies can be degraded, contaminated, or altered by heat, embalming substances, and handling. Even a reliable genetic profile would not automatically provide a name. It would require comparison with securely identified relatives, and those identifications may depend on the same labels under question. Genetics can establish biological relationships more readily than personal identity. Imaging can reveal age indicators, injuries, and embalming methods. But it also stops short of naming the dead. C4 makes the problem more urgent because it supplies a newly confirmed original burial place. Material from the tomb could, in theory, offer comparative evidence. Human remains, resin, linen, or biological traces securely associated with the first interment would be invaluable. But no confirmed royal body was found there. The surviving fragments identify the owner without providing a direct physical sample. Archaeology has located the room prepared for Thutmose II, while leaving the body attributed to him several kilometers away and centuries later in its documented history. There is also the possibility that the mummy followed a long route. If flood damage forced an early transfer from C4, the king may have been placed in a second tomb in the Western Wadis. Later robbery or official restoration could have moved him again. By the time priests brought royal remains to DB320, the body may already have passed through multiple coffins and burial places. Under that scenario, the cache mummy could still be Thutmose II, even though nothing about its later equipment resembles the original funeral in C4. The honest conclusion is narrower than either certainty or dismissal. CG 61066 remains the body traditionally identified and publicly displayed as Thutmose II. That attribution has been challenged by the C4 team and by broader difficulties in identifying 18th dynasty mummies. But it has not been disproved. The mummy should not be called a fake, because it is an authentic ancient royal body and may still be the king. Nor should its name be treated as beyond question. Its identity rests on a chain of ancient preservation, later discovery, and modern interpretation, each link valuable and imperfect. Until stronger evidence appears, the label remains useful and traditional, but unresolved rather than either proven or overturned. C4 solved the location of one burial without resolving the identity of one body. The tomb and mummy now face each other across the Theban landscape like two halves of a broken record. One holds the king's name but no king. The other holds a kingly body and a disputed name. Between them lies the missing journey, and perhaps, beneath an artificial mound in Wadi Sea, another monument capable of changing the balance. The possibility beneath the mound begins with a shape that does not belong comfortably to the natural valley. Near C4 rises what the excavation team calls the conglomerate pile, a mass originally estimated at 13 meters by 13 meters, across and about 11 meters high. From a distance, it can resemble an accumulation of limestone fragments, mud, and debris fallen from the surrounding slopes. Up close, its internal layers tell a more complicated story. The pile contains evidence that at least part of it was assembled deliberately. turning a damaged royal tomb into the entrance to a second, still unopened mystery. Excavation revealed alternating deposits of limestone, mortar, mud, a material containing ash from barley straw. Mixed through the mass were fragments of beer jars, the tip of a chisel, and impressions left by human feet. None of these details alone proves that a royal tomb lies below. Together, they show that people worked here, moved quantities of material, and created layers that cannot be explained solely by rockfall. The mound is not simply a geological accident. It is partly a human construction built with substances familiar from ancient building sites, where mud, stone, mortar, and organic material could stabilize, conceal, or reshape the ground. The scale of the work is difficult to appreciate. By November 2025, the team reported removing approximately 2,030 cubic meters of material by hand. That is not the clearing of a doorway. It is the dismantling of an artificial hill, where every basket of debris may contain evidence. Heavy machinery could destroy hidden walls, collapse an entrance, or erase the sequence showing how the mound was created. Workers therefore proceed slowly, recording layers, artifacts, and changes in composition while the mass above remains an engineering hazard. The hypothesis is that the conglomerate pile conceals a second burial monument prepared for Thutmose II after C4 was damaged by flooding. Under this reconstruction, Hatshepsut and royal officials concluded that the original tomb could no longer protect the king. A new chamber was cut nearby. The mummy and surviving equipment were transferred through the rescue corridor, and the replacement burial was then concealed beneath a constructed mound. The idea has narrative power because it connects several unresolved clues: the missing body, the absence of major funerary objects, the later corridor, the ritual deposit naming Aakheperenre, and the artificial structure within the same wadi. But the mound has not yielded the confirmation the hypothesis requires. As of the November 2025 report, the team had not announced a doorway, a passage, or a burial chamber beneath it. No intact second tomb had been opened. No sarcophagus, coffin, royal mummy, or assemblage of funerary equipment had emerged. The language must remain conditional. The excavators are testing whether the mound hides a second monument. They have not demonstrated that it does. Archaeology often advances through compelling patterns that later prove incomplete, and the most attractive explanation is not always correct. The association with Hatshepsut is persuasive but unproven. Her inscription on the ointment vessel shows that she made an object for Aakheperenre, and the sealed pit establishes ritual activity connected with the king in this part of the wadi. Yet the pit may have sanctified the valley generally, C4 specifically, or another monument nearby. It does not state that Hatshepsut ordered a second tomb beneath the conglomerate pile. The proposal that she and the architect Inini organized a replacement burial depends on combining inscriptions, landscape features, and later historical texts rather than reading a direct ancient declaration. Inini is relevant because an inscription from his tomb describes the secret construction of a royal burial for Thutmose I and uses language interpreted in connection with remote desert work and transported Nile mud. The C4 team has considered whether similar methods might explain the mound's unusual composition. Mud, mortar, and organic debris could have been carried into the wadi to build a concealing structure above a hidden entrance. Yet text composed for one king cannot automatically be transferred to another. The comparison offers a model, not proof, and scholars still debate how literally such autobiographical inscriptions describe construction practice. The human traces inside the pile are among its most evocative clues. A chisel point suggests stoneworking. Beer jar fragments belong to the everyday provisioning of labourers. Footprints capture moments when wet material was crossed before it hardened. These remains bring workers into the story more clearly than royal inscriptions do. Men hauled stone, mixed mud, carried jars, and climbed across the growing mass. Whether they were concealing a tomb, reshaping a flood channel, building a platform, or performing another task remains uncertain. Their movements survive, but their instructions do not. There are practical objections to the second tomb theory. Constructing another burial monument soon after a flood would demand time, secrecy, labour, and resources during a sensitive succession. If the king's body required immediate protection, officials might have used an existing tomb rather than wait for a new one. A large artificial mound could conceal an entrance, but it could also attract attention unless it blended convincingly with the valley. Later floods may have altered its form, making an ancient engineering feature appear more intentional or monumental than it originally was. No single explanation fully accounts for the mound's size, composition, and position. There is also the question of what an intact second burial would contain. Even if Thutmose II was transferred there, the monument may have been entered in antiquity. His body could have been removed again during the royal cache operations that brought numerous mummies to DB 320. Valuable objects might have been stripped centuries before modern excavation. The discovery of a second tomb would not guarantee another Tutankhamun. It might produce another damaged chamber, another set of fragments, or evidence that the king had moved yet again. This is why the conglomerate pile carries both promise and danger. It is the strongest physical candidate for extending the story beyond C4, but it can easily become a screen onto which every missing object is projected. The mummy, sarcophagus, burial treasure, and answers to the flood crisis all seem capable of waiting beneath it. Responsible interpretation must resist turning possibility into discovery before the rock is opened. For now, the mound remains closed at its centre. More than 2,000 cubic meters have been removed, and the evidence for human construction has grown stronger. Yet the decisive threshold has not appeared. Somewhere beneath the remaining layers may lie a second royal monument arranged after C4 failed, or the workers may uncover a different structure whose purpose changes the story again. The pile stands above Wadi Sea like a deliberately manufactured silence, containing not an answer but the next test. Archaeologists have found the tomb where Thutmose II was once buried. They are still searching for the place to which he may have been carried. The identification of C4 closes a long gap in the royal map of the early 18th dynasty, but it does not close the story. Archaeologists can now point to a rock-cut tomb in Wadi Sea and say, with strong evidence, that Thutmose II was buried there. They can reconstruct a staircase uncovered in 2022, a doorway reached days later, 4 rooms overwhelmed by mud and collapse, a royal ceiling painted blue with yellow stars, and damaged passages from the Amduat. They can hold fragments bearing the throne name Aakheperenre, and place Hatshepsut beside the funeral as great royal wife. Yet the central objects that would make the burial immediately recognizable are missing. The king is not there. His stone sarcophagus is not there. Most of the equipment intended to protect and provision him through eternity is not there. That is why the phrase empty burial remains useful only when its limits are understood. C4 was not an untouched chamber discovered without contents, nor was it a bare hole mistakenly promoted as a royal tomb. It retained precisely the material needed to reveal what had happened their inscribed stone vessels, pottery, painted plaster, celestial decoration, funerary text, architectural changes, flood deposits, and evidence of repeated access. The tomb is empty in the places that matter most to expectation, but full of evidence about loss. Its value lies in the relationship between what survived and what did not. The first mystery is now geographical rather than absolute. Before C4, the original burial place of Thutmose II was uncertain. After C4, the location can be identified with confidence, even though the monument is damaged. This is a substantial achievement. It places the king within the Western Wadis and challenges the older tendency to treat the region mainly as a cemetery for royal women. It also expands the known geography of early New Kingdom kingship beyond the familiar concentration in the Valley of the Kings. The Theban necropolis was not a finished system designed once and repeated. It was an evolving landscape in which rulers, queens, architects, and work crews experimented with security, symbolism, geology, and dynastic memory. The second mystery concerns the moment when C4 failed. Flood evidence shows that water entered with destructive force, carrying silt and rock into the descending passages. The chamber ceiling collapsed, decoration detached, and the burial environment became unstable. The excavators proposed that a severe flood may have struck within about 6 years of the interment. That reconstruction is plausible, but it is not a date preserved in an ancient record. Whether one catastrophic event or several floods produced the final condition remains uncertain. What can be said is that the tomb intended to resist time was compromised astonishingly early. The second corridor preserves the likely response. Its higher entrance into Chamber A, plastered surfaces, enlargement, and repeated ceiling suggest organized access after the original plan had been completed. A rescue operation explains these features better than a simple robber's tunnel, especially if deep mud blocked the formal route. Officials may have removed the mummy, coffins, ritual equipment, and portable valuables before closing the passage. But the corridor does not identify the destination, and it does not prove that every missing object left in one orderly transfer. Later robbery, reuse, restoration, and further reburial may all have reduced the assemblage over centuries. The third mystery is therefore the king's final resting place. The conglomerate pile offers a compelling possibility. Its limestone, mortar, mud, ash, pottery, tool fragment, and footprints demonstrate human construction on a large scale. The team has proposed that this artificial mound may conceal a second burial monument prepared after the flood. Hatshepsut's inscribed offering and the ritual pit nearby make the idea more persuasive, while the missing body and rescue corridor give it a reason to exist. Still, no entrance or chamber had been announced by the November 2025 excavation report. A hypothesis may be strong without yet becoming a discovery. Even the opening of a second tomb would not guarantee a final answer. It might be intact, disturbed, unfinished, or empty after another ancient transfer. It could preserve objects from Thutmose II while lacking his body. It could reveal a monument connected with Hatshepsut, another royal relative, or an entirely different phase of activity in the Wadi. Archaeology does not owe the present a satisfying arrangement of clues. The mound may contain the missing chapter, but it may also expose how many chapters have vanished. The fourth mystery waits in Cairo, where CG 61066 remains displayed under the name Thutmose II. Ancient dockets and traditional attribution support that identification, while questions about biological age, reused burial equipment, and unusual labels weaken certainty. Neither side possesses decisive proof. The body should not be dismissed as fraudulent, because it is an authentic ancient royal mummy, and may indeed be Thutmose II. Nor should the museum label be treated as the end of inquiry. The conflict between a named but bodiless tomb and a bodied but disputed name is one of the most remarkable consequences of the discovery. Together, these problems transform Thutmose II from a minor figure between famous reigns into the centre of our archaeological investigation. His short or uncertain reign, his marriage to Hatshepsut, the succession of Thutmose III, the development of royal burial in Western Thebes, the environmental danger of the Wadis, and the later rescue of royal mummies now meet in one place. C4 does not merely add another tomb number to a map. It links political history, funerary religion, climate, architecture, conservation, and human remains in a single unresolved chain. The discovery also changes the meaning of absence. The missing sarcophagus is not simply a disappointment, it is evidence that demands a sequence of actions. The absent mummy raises questions about ancient rescue and modern identification. The missing treasure redirects attention toward ordinary fragments that carried names when gold could not. A duck-shaped vessel, a 2-centimeter inscription, a patch of blue plaster, or a footprint in ancient mud can become more historically valuable than a spectacular object without context. The excavation's achievement lies in making these quiet materials speak, without requiring them to say more than they can. As work continues in Wadisi, new fragments may join, new layers may be removed, and the artificial mound may reveal its purpose. The interpretation could strengthen, narrow, or change. That openness is not a weakness in archaeology. It is the discipline's most honest condition. C4 has answered the question of where Thutmose II was once buried. It has not answered where he ultimately went, which mummy is truly his, or what survived the first funeral. The tomb found after a century of searching has become a doorway into 3 larger uncertainties. And so the story slows where the excavation continues, beneath a desert sky that looks permanent only from the span of a human life. The cliffs of Western Thebes still hold heat through the day and release it after sunset. Dry channels cross the Wadis like pale scars, silent until rare water moves through them again. Somewhere among those folds, workers once carried a dead king toward chambers painted with stars. They believed stone, ritual, and secrecy could preserve his identity beyond the reach of change. For a time, perhaps, they succeeded. Then water entered, walls broke. Officials opened another path, and the king passed out of the tomb prepared for him. His name remained behind on shattered vessels. His painted night fell to the floor. Centuries later, other priests gathered royal bodies into hiding, attaching names to coffins and linen as carefully as circumstances allowed. Still later, archaeologists returned with lights, brushes, maps, and questions, lifting pieces from mud that had hardened around them. Human beings build against forgetting, but memory rarely survives in the form intended. A monument may lose its body and preserve its name. A body may preserve its face and lose the certainty of its identity. A mound may protect a chamber, or only the hope that a chamber exists. Across thousands of years, the story breaks apart, and every generation receives only fragments. Thutmose II once stood at the centre of a living court. Priests spoke his titles, craftsmen shaped his vessels, and Hatshepsut prepared offerings in his name. Now his presence is quieter. It rests in the curve of pale stone, the trace of a yellow star, and a corridor cut above a ruined floor. Perhaps he lies beneath the mound. Perhaps he is already known under uncertain linen. Perhaps the last place that held him has disappeared completely. Nothing about that final image is complete, yet completeness may never have been the true measure of survival. The king endures not because his burial remained untouched, but because enough pieces escaped destruction to restore a pattern. They wait in darkness, carrying a name across an interval no architect could have imagined. The desert does not answer. Evening gathers over the Western Wadis, softening the cliffs and filling the entrances with shadow. Beneath the stone, C4 remains both a discovery and an absence, the house of eternity that lost its king, and the broken map that may yet lead to him.